A Father's Promise by Donnalynn Hess. Chapter 25. The Passing of Night. March 1945. He shall deliver thee in 6 troubles. Yea, in 7 there shall no evil touch thee. In famine he shall redeem thee from death, and in war from the power of the sword. Job 5:19 and 20. Rudy awakened to the rumbling sounds of heavy vehicles in the distance. Such sounds should not have seemed unusual, but the woods had been strangely quiet for the last several weeks. He decided to go see if he could discern how close the trouble really was. Cautiously, he ventured out into the field. As he did, he saw a farmer running, though he could see nothing behind the man that would make him flee. As the man came closer, Rudy heard him shouting, "The Huns are on the run! They're on the run!" he yelled, to no one in particular, for no one but Rudy was about, and Rudy knew that the farmer had not caught sight of him yet. Abandoning all caution, Rudy rushed out to meet the man. "Hey," he called to him. "Hey, what was that you said?" The man stopped and shouted once again. "They're on the run, I tell you," he laughed. "The Germans are getting licked everywhere." "How do you know that?" said Rudy, growing skeptical. "Listen," he shouted. "Can you hear it?" "I've heard these sounds plenty of times," said Rudy, and it never meant that the Germans were losing before." "Well, if you don't believe what you hear," the farmer said, "maybe you'll believe what you read." Reaching into his back pocket, he pulled out a crumpled newspaper. "Look at this," he said, waving the paper in Rudy's face. Rudy grabbed it from him, for it was impossible to read with the man flapping it in front of him. "Red Army advances into Poland," the headlines read. "Then the Russians are really coming to liberate Poland?" asked Rudy. "Not coming," said the man. "They're here. That paper there is weeks old." The old man was nearly dancing a jig, while Rudy stood as if it were frozen to the ground. He was afraid to move, afraid that if he did, he would awaken and find that he was dreaming. "I tell you, Warsaw has been liberated. All of Poland is free," the old man said. Rudy still said nothing. "What's wrong with you, boy? Can't you hear what I'm saying?" I hear you, Rudy assured him. It's just, well, it's almost too good to be true." "It's true all right," the man said, slapping Rudy on the back. "Those Germans are fleeing for their lives, and I'm going to run all over countryside shouting it until everybody knows." With these parting words, he was off again, waving his newspaper in the air and yelling, "It's over," Rudy said to himself. "It's over," Rudy said to himself. "I can't believe it, but it's really over." The old man's voice had barely faded out of range when Rudy heard more voices. He looked up to see a small group of men approaching, and he could see that some of them wore uniforms. "Soldiers," he said, his caution returning. "Well, they're not going to get me this close to the end." He was about to take to his heels when he saw that the soldiers had no guns. There were 4 men behind them, however, who did. These men were dressed in tattered clothes. Rudy realized that the Germans had been taken captive. He was uncertain, however, whether the captors were Polish or Russian. "Keep them moving, boys," one of the men with the gun shouted. Rudy was startled, for he thought he recognized the voice. He waited eagerly, hoping the man would speak again. "We haven't far to go now," the man said. As soon as Rudy heard the voice a second time, he took off running toward him. "Oscar! Oscar!" Rudy cried. Oscar turned quickly and aimed the gun at him. Rudy stopped. "Put that down," he called to him. "It's me, Rudy." Oscar's stern face broke into a smile. He left his men with the prisoners and came running up to meet Rudy. "I thought I taught you never to startle a man who's carrying a gun," Oscar scolded. "I can see you still have a lot to learn." Rudy willingly took the rebuke. He understood that a reprimand from Oscar's idea of a friendly greeting. Oscar then stood back to look Rudy over carefully. "I say, you certainly have grown. And where do you get fitted out with such fancy clothes? Those aren't the ones we had on the last days I saw you." "Anna gave them to me," said Rudy. "By the way, Where's my scarf? Oscar asked cheerfully. Well, Rudy hesitated. Anna burned it. Burned it? Oscar, genuinely indignant, stepped back. What in the world did you let her do that for? Oscar, you know once Anna sets her mind to something, even you can't change it, Rudy told him. How in the world did you expect me to stop her? Oscar had to agree. But what in the world possessed her to do a thing like that anyway, he asked. It was awfully dirty, Rudy said. Woman? Oscar said. Then he added it rather pitifully. She could have washed instead of burning it. Rudy could not help smiling. No, he said, I have to stick up for her there. It wouldn't have done any good to wash it. I'd been wearing it for over 3 years by the time she got to it, and who knows how long you had it. You had had it. 3 years? You mean you didn't go back to see her for 3 whole years? I was afraid to, said Rudy. He was rather relieved that Oscar had finally gotten off the subject of the scarf. Things got really bad around here for a while, he explained. The Germans were going about burning the villages and anyone who helped either a Jew or a Polish soldier. I didn't want to risk it, especially since Joseph seemed so pro-German. What changed your mind? Asked Oscar. Well, it's a rather long story, said Rudy. Oscar stood waiting, so Rudy continued. Right after I left you, I found a little girl in a hayloft. You know, you used to tell me about children who slept in lofts and begged their food. Anyway, she was there. She was 3, maybe 4. When I found her, I took her with me and took care of her. We got along fine. Thanks to all I'd taught you, interrupted Oscar. True, said Rudy. At any rate, after 3 years, she got sick. Some kind of rash. I waited a while, hoping it would just go away, but of course it didn't. I had no idea what to do, so I took her to Anna. Anna fixed her up, I'm sure, said Oscar. Yes, she did, said Rudy. I stayed with her for a year, helping around the farm. Oscar looked surprised. Joseph didn't object? He wasn't around at first. He'd gone to Warsaw. Oscar was immediately suspicious. For what? The Poles were suffering terribly under the Germans there. Not if you played up the Germans, Rudy said. That idiot, shouted Oscar. Anyway, continued Rudy, he came back to the farm after a few months. Why? Asked Oscar. Some kind of unrest in the city, said Rudy. Oscar laughed a mirthless laugh. I see. A coward as well as an idiot. He didn't stay long, said Rudy. He headed back as soon as he heard things were under control again. I left the same time he did. I thought it would be safer for Anna. Do you think he informed the German authorities that you'd been there? Asked Oscar. That wouldn't help Anna anyway, you know. Not a chance, said Rudy. Like you said, he's a coward, and I threatened him within an inch of his life. Oscar smiled. I've also been keeping an eye on the place from a distance, Rudy added. Things are fine. Well, you don't have to worry anymore, said Oscar. We finally rousted the enemy, at least the German enemy. As for Joseph, well, he'd better not show his face around there while I'm there. Is it true then? Asked Rudy. Are the Germans really done for? They're done for all right, Oscar said. They're fleeing towards Germany as fast as they can, but it won't do any good. We'll chase them right into their homeland. Then it's safe to go back to Warsaw? Asked Rudy. I don't see why not, answered Oscar. I'm sure there have been Russian troops on these roads for several days now. Surely you've seen them. Now how would I see them? Asked Rudy. As I recall, the man who taught me to survive in the forest told me repeatedly to stay deep in the woods during the daylight hours. That didn't seem to stop you today, said Oscar, feigning disapproval. You've got me there, admitted Rudy. By the way, have the prisoners from the camps been released? Oscar's expression changed. Many of them, yes, he said. You didn't happen to hear anything about my father, did you? No, said Oscar, but he hesitated. But what? Asked Rudy. The camps, well, he stopped again. Come on, Oscar, out with it, demanded Rudy. Don't get your hopes up, Rudy, he said. What do you mean? Asked Rudy. I mean that German camps were not exactly work camps. Rudy could feel his stomach knotting up. What were they then? He asked. They were more like death camps, said Oscar. Many, many people died, especially Jews. But not all. No, not all. Then I won't lose hope, said Rudy. I can't blame you for that, Oscar said. God kept me, Oscar, Rudy said. He could have kept my father as well. Oscar sighed. Maybe, but his tone sounded skeptical. Even if your father is alive, it may be a while before you find him. Why? Many of the Jews taken from Warsaw were shipped to camps hundreds of miles from here. It may take them a good long time to get back home. I don't mind waiting, said Rudy. I've had a lot of practice. Oscar changed the subject. Say, why don't you come along with me? Where are you heading? Rudy asked. We stopped first at Anna's for a bite to eat and a little discussion about a particular red wool scarf. And then, asked Rudy. Then on to Warsaw, Oscar answered. We should be there by evening. What about them? Said Rudy, pointing toward the German prisoners. We'll keep a close watch on them until we get to Warsaw, Oscar said. I doubt they'll give us any trouble. They're pretty well beaten. Rudy looked carefully at the prisoners for the first time. None of them could have been older than 16. They look awful young, he commented. I know, the Germans were getting pretty desperate. Why else would they send boys to fight a man's war? There's not a one of them who is even old enough to shave yet. If they'd been true soldiers, we wouldn't have captured them, I assure you. Rudy pretended surprised. You mean you would have been able to take them? You wouldn't have been able to take them? No, Oscar shouted. I mean, we'd have shot them. But I don't shoot boys. I'm Polish, not German. Well, one thing's for sure, said Rudy. When Anna sees them, she'll feed them a good meal. Oscar grinned. You're right there. Her mother's heart is the only thing that takes precedence over her patriotism. And after they've tasted Anna's cooking, you'll have to force them back to Germany, Rudy added. Will you join us for some of that cooking? Oscar asked. No, I can't, said Rudy. I must go straight to Warsaw. But do me a favor, will you? Anything, said Oscar. Tell Anna that I'll be back for Ingrid, the little girl I told you about. As soon as I've located my father, you'll remember to tell her that, won't you? I will, said Oscar. You plan to continue caring for Ingrid even now that the war is over. I'm sure there are those in Warsaw who would care for her. This war has left plenty of children orphans. Ingrid won't be going to any orphanage, said Rudy firmly. She's become like a sister to me. She's not an orphan anymore. She's fortunate to have such a brother, said Oscar. I think so too, Rudy agreed, striving to put a cheerful note. I'll see you soon, if not at Anna's, then in Warsaw. Then he waved goodbye and departed. As Rudy walked toward the road that led into the city, he thought on the events of the last few years. During that time he had experienced a great many things. He had seen men at their worst and best, and he knew that what he had seen had changed him forever.